Hello and welcome to today's Knowledge is Great lecture. Energy Megaprojects. Is bigger always better? My name is Leighton Erzberger. I'm the Director of Education and English at the British Council East Asia, based here in Singapore. So please connect with you all. The Knowledge is Great lecture series was launched in 2015 by the British Council in Singapore. It showcases the UK's knowledge, creativity, and innovation by inviting leading UK specialists to speak on areas of topical debate and discussion. If you have joined us on these lectures before, you will know that we will be running these lectures once a month for the rest of the year, typically on the last Thursday of each month, wherever possible. So do look out for invitations to future lectures. A quick run through the program. First, I will invite Miss Lucy Watkins, Director of British Council Singapore, to introduce our speaker for the evening, Professor Benjamin Sovacool. Professor Sovacool will then deliver his lecture, and once he is done, he will hand over back to me to host the questions and answer sessions. If you do have any questions that you would like to pose to Professor Sovacool, you can type these into the chat box. And you could also raise your hand, and if I can spot it, then you can also unmute and ask your question too. So if you would like to type your question, feel free. If you want to ask yourself, just raise your hand and I will try and come to you. My colleague took questions from you all before today's session. So as the call is progressing, we will post those questions into the chat. It would help me that if you like the questions that you see, rather than type it out again, feel free to use the like button so that I can see how many questions are in particular demand for asking. And if you don't see your question, please feel free to type your question in the chat, and others, please like it, and that will help me choose the questions that are most relevant to you. We will aim to close the session right on time. Please do take note that we are recording this session for the benefit of those who could not attend. So without further ado, let us begin. I'm very pleased to introduce you all to Miss Lucy Watkins. Miss Watkins is Regional Director, British Council East Asia, as well as Country Director for the British Council Singapore. She has over 25 years of experience working in the fields of education and culture for the British Council operations in China, Thailand, and the UK. She took up her current role in Singapore in August 2017, first as our Deputy Regional Director, and then taking on additional responsibilities as Country Director Singapore, and more recently as the East Asia Regional Director. Her previous roles include Country Director China, Regional Head of East and South Asia, based in the British Council's headquarters in London, and also spent some time on secondment as First Secretary Scottish Affairs for the Scottish Government from the British Embassy in China. Lucy will provide the opening address and will then introduce our speaker. So over to you, Lucy.
Thank you, Leighton, for the introduction. Good evening, everyone, and good morning to those of you who've joined us from the UK today. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's lecture. As Leighton has just said, the British Council Knowledge is Great lectures present opportunities for academics, practitioners, students, and the general public to engage in stimulating discussions on a wide range of topics in the arts, science, the environment, and more. The Great Lectures typically explore topics of significant interest both to the UK and to Singapore, and indeed to countries worldwide. This year, the lecture series began with a focus on a theme of global significance, climate change, and environmental sustainability. And these lectures have been extremely timely, completing a steady drumbeat of activities around climate change in the run-up to the 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference of the Parties, COP26, which is being hosted by the UK in Glasgow in November this year. When we then moved on from that lecture series to our most recent lecture in an extremely relevant field in today's global environment, online work and the gig economy. And we looked at how this created a new class of workers who are flexible, adaptable, agile, and highly mobile. We heard from Dr. Stephanie from the University of Oxford how the vast majority of people working through online labour platforms were doing so by choice, mostly because they enjoyed the flexibility and freedom associated with their work. If you missed Dr. Stephanie's lecture, or indeed any of the previous lectures, please visit our Knowledge is Great webpage. You'll find video recordings of all these lectures there. Today we'll return to the sustainability theme, now with a focus on energy. We've all been hearing the buzzwords sustainability, green jobs, green energy, energy efficiency from governments, corporations, media, academics, indeed even in our everyday conversations, the number of green ticks on our home appliances, for example. We understand that how we produce and use energy can have significant impact on human health and on air and also on water quality. We know that energy technologies are changing rapidly, improving efficiency and environmental sustainability. In the UK, the Prime Minister has set out plans to build back greener by making the UK the world leader in clean wind energy, creating jobs, slashing carbon emissions and boosting exports. A key part of the Singapore Green Plan 2030 is energy reset, with targets to quadruple solar energy deployment by 2025, including through solar panels covering the rooftops of HDB blocks. Singapore is now home to one of the world's largest floating solar farms. In Lanskes, Singapore, the success of such a sea-based floating system could lead the way for more such projects to tap energy from the sun here and in the region. So with this theme of energy projects in mind, we're delighted to have with us today Professor Benjamin Sovacool from the University of Sussex, who will talk to us about energy megaprojects, what these are, whether they deliver on their promised benefits, what key issues are often associated with them, including political leadership, regulation, financing, and environmental impact. So it's my pleasure to now introduce Professor Sovacool to you. Professor Benjamin K. Sovacool is Professor of Energy Policy at the University of Sussex Business School. There, he serves as Director of the Sussex Energy Group. Professor Sovacool works as a researcher and consultant on issues pertaining to energy policy, energy justice, energy security, climate change mitigation, and climate change adaptation. More specifically, his research focuses on renewable energy and energy efficiency, the politics of large-scale energy infrastructure, the ethics and morality of energy decisions, designing public policy to improve energy security and access to electricity, and building adaptive capacity to the consequences of climate change. His research has been endorsed by former US President Bill Clinton, the Prime Minister of Norway Gro Harlem Brundtland, and the late Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom, amongst others. He's lead author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's Sixth Assessment Report, AR6, which is due to be published in 2022, and is an advisor on energy to the European Commission's Directorate General for Research and Innovation in Brussels, Belgium. Professor Sovacool has played a key role in winning collaborative research grants worth more than $28 million in directly managed funds. In the United Kingdom, he served as principal investigator on projects funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, the Natural Environment Research Council, and the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. And he is the recipient of multiple national and international awards and honours. With much coverage of his work in the international news media, Professor Sovacool is one of the most highly cited global researchers on issues bearing on controversies in energy and climate policy. Professor Sovacool also has his own ties with Singapore. He worked at the National University of Singapore for slightly over 4 years as assistant professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and as research fellow at the Centre on Asia and Globalization. So today is probably a bit of a homecoming event too, albeit a virtual one. Professor Sovacool, we look forward to hearing from you, and I'm delighted to hand over to you now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lucy, for a fantastic introduction. And yes, I do wish I was there in Singapore. I can tell you the char kway teow and the curry laksa are not nearly as good here in London, although they do at least make their attempts. Today's presentation's pretty interesting because it will cut across many of the themes that you mentioned earlier in my research agenda: politics, justice, climate change, as well as I think the purpose of the Knowledge is Great series, which in a way is really about interdisciplinary work that cuts across the social sciences, the natural sciences, and the arts and humanities. So I wanted to start at least by acknowledging that much of this work is from a book published with Edward Elgar. So I am indebted to my co-author, Christopher Cooper, who obviously isn't here today with me, but Christopher helped researching some of the case studies, traveling into Asia, into Mongolia, actually, as well as South Korea. He led the case study where we did on what's called Gobi Tech. And I also want to acknowledge funding, in that this research never would have been possible because field research is usually expensive without generous support from the National University of Singapore and from the Asia Research Institute, who funded it at that time. So let's begin. I think Aristotle once said a few thousand years ago that those who control the definition control the debate. And that also remains true whenever you try to define a megaproject, because I'm sure some of you have seen this term used in a variety of different ways. So the way that we defined it in our research project and in our book is there's a financial element to a megaproject and there's a geographic element to a megaproject. So it has to be capital intensive, but spatially big. Hence the title of this talk is Bigger Better. And that basically meant we defined it in two ways. We said, well, when we did this project a few years ago, it had to be at least $1 billion US. So that does exclude some just multi-million dollar projects. And also because our project was focused on energy, it also had to relate to energy. So we're talking things like power plants, dams, pipelines, interstate grids. Because we were also interested in this geopolitical dimension, we also, maybe a bit arbitrarily, said, well, in terms of spatially large, we had to have it be transnational. Now, that does mean that many megaprojects are not transnational. While many megaprojects can be within a country, we said they had to involve at least 2 or more countries, often 3 or 4 or even 5. And we're talking direct spatial involvement, not financial involvement, because even national infrastructure projects can still have consortia, like the Deepwater Horizon platform, that span 20 or 30 countries. We meant the project had to physically, with its technology, span a scope of at least 2 countries or more. One of the interesting things that we mention in the book is kind of going to the fundamental drivers of these mega projects. Why are they being promoted? If they're so intense and they're so expensive and they're so big, what's behind them? And just to give you a statistic, something like 80% of recent infrastructure projects in the past 10 years are mega projects. They meet this definition of being transnational, and they meet this definition of actually having $1 billion or more. So something's going on, something is afoot. And in the book, we talk about a lot of drivers. There are thinkers, including Nobel economists, who talk about how economies of scale are achieved as you go bigger. So you centralize, and in doing so, can do things in ways that you just couldn't do at smaller scales. There are also pushes for capital intensity. There's this idea that, well, if you want to provide an energy solution, why not build one big thing that can affect 1 million people, rather than 1 million small things that have to go into 1 million separate homes? It's the equivalent of controlling a school bus versus 25 cars. The school bus is a bit easier to get students back and forth to the school. There's also this notion that as you get bigger, you can pool resources. So Singapore may specialize in high tech, but Malaysia may specialize in palm oil, and Indonesia may specialize, let's just say, in subsea cables. So the idea is that if you involve all three, you can tap into their specialization and pool their resources. Similarly, you can also pool larger pools of manufacturing and labor. And many of you in Singapore know that many big projects in Singapore still rely on foreign labor, maybe from India, maybe from the Middle East, maybe from other parts of Southeast Asia. So you have a accumulation of skills, not just resources and specialization. It also enables you to stockpile and avoid duplication. It would be pretty expensive if Singapore decided to do a mega project and Malaysia wanted to do the same thing. That would cost twice as much. There's also this idea of sharing. and that megaprojects allow you to actually cooperate, which goes very, very well with ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, notion of kind of cooperation and non-interference, where we all work together as a common pool of resources. And I think this one is the most important and the most specific to energy systems. Is the idea is that you can create synergy. You can link specific energy subsystems together to create a greater system that is more than the sum of its parts, and in doing so, improve innovation dynamics and improve market efficiencies. And also the inverse is true. This is a bit weird, but in places of conflict, so one of our case studies involves North Korea. In cases of conflict, there's also this sense of we're in it together. We're a coalition of the willing, and we're willing to share risks and help promote a shared sense of responsibility. So it also goes kind of hand in hand with soft power projection and with political, I guess, benefits rather than just kind of economic and more geographic benefits. What's also interesting is there are a number of factors at play in megaprojects because they're so unique. There is a discussion in the literature on economics that talks about the agglomeration of industry, and this is basically that as you pool industry, you can cluster. And I know Malaysia has its clusters as well. I think one is actually right across the border from you in Johor. Another one is Putrajaya. Another one is Cyberjaya. So there's this notion of we can cluster and specialize and create centers of excellence that can help pool from these mega projects. I know that the UK is trying to do this now with their new industrial decarbonization strategy. It's based on 6 clusters. There's also this notion that regulation can stifle innovation, and basically kind of the idea here is the permitting costs and the licensing costs for a big project may be the same as a small project. And those licensing costs, because they can be so prohibitive, they may rule out a small project. And so what you see here on the left, this is from the United States, from the Environmental Protection Agency, which is showing you compliance costs with regulation. And basically what it shows you is on the top, you've got lower costs because a mega project can absorb them. And on the bottom, you have higher costs where small companies can't even afford to compete. They cannot meet the regulations. So the idea here is that regulations themselves may be pushing the community towards, because of their transaction costs, more mega projects. Another factor that I don't like to talk about because it makes me feel old is aging. There's also this idea that a lot of the specialized talent we have in some of these specific systems, nuclear reactor design, maybe photonics, they're getting older. And so there's also this notion of, oh my gosh, we need to act now while we have the civil engineering, the mechanical engineering, the physics, the capabilities to do these projects before our talent ages. So it's kind of a strike while the iron is hot notion to tap into our resources before people may retire. And then there are also, of course, these nationally linked companies floating around. Singapore has some, Malaysia has some government-linked companies that are also trying to innovate. And it could be that they cannot do it themselves and therefore have to do partnerships with other transnational firms. I think there's finally this notion of standards that's floating around. And we call this the seduction of standards, in that mega projects are alluring because they help you harmonize diverse elements or systems components into a single goal. Great example here, which we'll talk about more, is the Trans-ASEAN gas pipeline network. The idea here is we need a standardized way of funneling cubic meters of natural gas. And the seduction of that platform is that it could help you standardize gas supplies from very different qualities and very different regions, as far away as the Philippines, over to Thailand, down to Indonesia, maybe even over to the island of Borneo. And then I suppose behind all of this is the allure of doing big technology. David Nye, who's a historian, has a great term for this. He calls this the technological sublime. And his argument is kind of tricky. It's that modern big technology is almost religious to us, in the same way that cathedrals or the pyramids of Egypt were very significant to earlier populations. We get fascinated with big tech. with space tech, with big projects. They're just alluring, and they demonstrate that our societies have progressed, that we have a higher standard of civilization, that we are modern. And even national programs like the nuclear program in France, Charles de Gaulle promoted it because he wanted France to look modern after the devastation of World War II. So they're also alluring megaprojects, not just for kind of physical reasons, but for kind of emotional, symbolic ones, that you can plant a flag and classify your country as hypermodern for its ability to pull off this very sophisticated project. This modernistic element of megaprojects, this visionary, this ability for them to be an imaginary, can create some wickedly crazy ideas. So we mentioned this in the book. This is one megaproject, which personally, I'm very happy didn't happen, but it shows you the visions that people have. This vision was called Elantropa, and the vision was to dam the Mediterranean so that the Mediterranean Sea could become farmland. What a grand vision. I'm not sure I like it, but at least it shows you, like, some of these things are so grand, they would change entire oceans or seas into converted farmland. This is the ambition or the hubris behind many of these mega projects. So, with that behind us, defining what a mega project is, showing you some of the drivers, symbolic, financial, political, and physical, and just how grand some of those visions can be, our book chose 4 case studies, which is a lot. Some books choose 1 or 2. And the case studies were meant to select different energy systems. So the first case study is the BTC Pipeline. Stands for Baku Tbilisi Ceyhan. It's a crude oil pipeline in 3 countries in Central Asia. So Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey. And if we have any James Bond fans, it features in the film The World Is Not Enough. It's the pipeline that the terrorists are trying to blow up. So it is a prominent global pipeline that was backed by the United States and other actors to help diversify supplies of oil and gas away from Russia out of the Caspian Sea. The second example is one that Singapore is a part of. It is the Trans-ASEAN Gas Pipeline Network, or the TAGP. And again, it's even more expensive. It would be 3 or 4 times more expensive than the BTC pipeline, although only about half of it is constructed so far. We're talking about a potential $40 billion network that helps stitch together dispersed gas networks that are currently still national networks into an integrated pipeline network, similar to the one in Europe. But this one would be done across huge swaths of Southeast Asia. And it's one thing to mention them, it's another to show you. So this is the Baku Tbilisi Ceyhan pipeline. It has been built. It's in green. Red is an associated pipeline, the Trans-Caucasus pipeline, which is a gas pipeline, which also is complete. So it's a bit confusing because they share the same corridor up until pieces of Turkey, and then they disperse. But you can see the pipeline is quite long, and it's also skirting some potentially unstable regions like Georgia, still have conflict, as well as Armenia, which is engaged in a low-intensity conflict with Azerbaijan. This shows you, more recently, the current status of the Trans-ASEAN gas pipeline network. And again, you can see it's pretty big. It is tapping through large sources of gas reserves, although there are also huge parts of it that are not yet completed, like the segment that would connect the Philippines, or perhaps the segment that would go under Brunei and connect it to peninsular Malaysia, or perhaps Singapore. We also wanted our case studies to not just look at fossil fuels and not to just look at pipelines. So our third case study is a hydroelectric dam. But of course, if you remember, we wanted our cases to involve multiple countries. So we had to choose a transnational dam. And so we actually chose SCORE, which is the Sarawak corridor of renewable energy. Sarawak is one of the 2 Malaysian states of Borneo, but it's transnational because the plan for SCORE is to build up to 8 dams that would then create a network that would go across Brunei and parts of Indonesia, Kalimantan. And again, while the earlier Trans-ASEAN gas pipeline network could be 40 billion, SCORE could be 100 billion. So you can see we're already getting even bigger and bigger. And at the time of our book, one dam, Bakun, was created 2,400 megawatts, and one Maroom, about 900 megawatts, was under construction. I'm pretty sure that's changed since then. I'm pretty sure that there's probably been a few more dams that have been completed since then. Remember that we were doing our field research a few years ago. And then finally, the biggest one of all, the $500 billion project, is the Asian version of Desert Tech. Desert Tech was a plan to use Morocco and Northern Africa as a source of solar energy that would then funnel electricity all the way up to Germany and parts of Western Europe. So not to be left out, they also proposed Gobi Tech. That's why it's also got a similar name. Rather than using North Africa, Gobi Tech would use the Gobi Desert in Mongolia to provide a huge amount of energy or electricity to a whole variety of Northeast Asian countries, China, Japan, North Korea, South Korea. And because of that scale and size, it would be, if it ever goes forward, a massively sized mega project. So what's also interesting about these mega projects is not only are they different sizes and different technologies, they're different scales and stages. So the BTC pipeline is complete. It's been completed for almost a decade. The Transocean gas pipeline network is about halfway complete. SCORE, at the time that we did it, was about a fourth complete. And Gobi Tech was only on paper. It hasn't yet been built. So it's like the most fantastic, but also the most uncertain. And we also liked that because we're capturing these governance dynamics of mega projects at very different stages of their development. Oh, and by the way, this just shows you plans for SCORE. So here you can see the island of Sarawak. You can see where they're planning to tap into the river basins, where they've mapped the hydro sites, how much energy it would produce, energy that wouldn't just go towards consumers and households, but also towards industry. When we were doing our research, it was aluminium smelting and other heavy industry, which would help Malaysia as a whole meet some of their industrial strategy targets. And here is the fantastic plan for Gobi Tech, which goes from the capital city of Mongolia, which is Ulaanbaatar, taps into the Gobi Desert, which is mostly just sand and a few nomadic communities, where it would then funnel electricity towards HVDC networks. One leg goes to Beijing and Shanghai, one leg goes out towards the Korean Peninsula and Seoul, and then there's a subsea cable that attaches from Busan that takes it into Japan. And for those of you that study energy security, you will know that Japan and South Korea have very pressing energy dependence concerns, hence the allure. North Korea is an energy deprived region, so we could actually get them off of nuclear fuel, that's the argument, and shift them over to solar energy. And then, of course, China is in the middle of its energy scramble for as much energy as possible. And of course, Beijing and Shanghai are major urban centers that also need electricity. So the idea is that Gobi Tech, in its beauty, could solve all of those concerns at once, as long as, of course, you're able to make this grid secure. So once we had our 4 cases chosen, we then had to pick our methods. And what I like, some of the things we still do at Sussex, we really pride ourselves on mixed methods research, as well as comparative research, as well as case studies research. So we decided to have our case studies be the mega projects themselves, rather than say the case study was Malaysia or Thailand. And this gives you a thick description, or if you want a simpler term, a really good story about how each case study works. We sampled elite actors, and this means that in a way we tried to get experts. We tried to get actual decision makers, people with extreme technical knowledge, or people who are behind the levers of power and policy. So we're getting you perspectives from government ministries. We're getting you perspectives from financing firms. We're getting you perspectives from engineering and technology companies. We're getting you perspectives from development banks. It was grounded, which means we did not disposition ourselves to be for or against any of the mega projects. We had no predetermined hypotheses other than the hypotheses we test, which I'll talk about, and we had no predetermined conclusion. We let that emerge, grounded in the data itself. It was ethnographic, which is a kind of technique that just means we were neutral. We didn't correct people. We didn't prompt them. When we were doing our interviews, we weren't saying, oh, tell us how this project is rubbish, or tell us how this project is great. So we didn't intervene. The researchers themselves were pleasantly independent, dispassionate, and neutral in our collection of data, which is a way to try to avoid bias and also a way to try to respect your respondents. We use semi-structured interviews as our main tool. These have different terms. These are basically 2 to 3 hour interviews. And because we were well funded, but also because the project was so large, we did a lot of them. We did 253 interviews at 113 institutions in 20 separate countries. Some of these countries were not in Asia. We went to DC, Washington, DC, to interview the World Bank. We went to the Philippines to interview people in the Asian Development Bank. We went to other places like Germany to interview people who were designing technology for Gobi Tech, state-of-the-art solar array. So that's why we have so many countries, and that's why even though we had an Asian focus, a lot of our methods went around the world to get as much good data, original data, as we could. Basically, it was also a chance to get away from our desks. This was done before COVID, and of course, it's kind of neat to go into the Gobi Desert or to go into Myanmar or Thailand or to observe, Central Asian Caspian pipeline politics ourselves. So myself and Christopher Cooper and my colleague Toby Carroll led the field research, all three of us, and it was fun. I said earlier, I hinted that we had a conceptual framework, and our conceptual framework, also sticking with SPRU, which is where I am now, the Science Policy Research Unit, was very interdisciplinary and very multidimensional. So in our conceptual work, we focused on 5 key themes or propositions. One of them comes from the governance literature, and it says that these mega projects get governance challenges because there are so many stakeholders that get involved, too many constituents, right? Too many cooks spoil the broth. We tapped into research in the technical systems literature about complexity and coupling. And this comes from people like Murrow or Perrow, who are talking about how larger systems have more risks because you have to orchestrate larger constituent components. We met with and engaged with people talking about democracy. This is Langdon Winner and others about democratic politics of technology. And this gets into more issues of corruption, issues of representation, issues of authoritarianism. We certainly tapped into the economics literature, especially externalities, about how these mega projects may consolidate benefits but externalize or socialize costs. And finally, we tapped into people like Bent Flilberg, who talk about risk assessment and how mega projects can fail because of bias in planning, because of sunk costs, because they're able to capture a vision and knowing full well that once you start the project, it's going to be really hard to stop it because these projects have their own inertia or path dependence or obduracy. And that's where we had these propositions tied to these different theories. One of our propositions was that stakeholder involvement can fragment design. One was that these mega projects will suffer from costliness. One was that they will seek to externalize costs in very negative ways. One was that they may erode democracy. And one was that project sponsors might oversell things just a bit. And now I'm going to take you on a journey using some of the evidence from our case studies across the 4 projects. And these are all photographs that we took as the research team. So we are starting with the BTC pipeline. The BTC pipeline, we did find, had some of those propositions confirmed. It turns out that the corridors for the pipeline are not empty. They're huge sources of farming and herding. So this actually shows you sheep being herded. The ground beneath them is the BTC pipeline. This is in Georgia, the country Georgia, not the state. And as a part of the pipeline construction process, you also had to relocate hundreds of communities, many of them ethnic minorities, away from the pipeline corridor. And even though we did our interviews years after the BTC was constructed, many of these stakeholders were still very angry and upset. They spoke of destroyed roads. They spoke of damage to their homes. They spoke of interference with agriculture from the construction process. And they also spoke of low intensity attacks against the pipeline, which then leak oil, or attacks at compressor stations, which can cause fires, which then damage and degrade local livelihood. So in this way, the pipeline was seen as a way of benefiting BP and maybe US aid and other important actors like the IFC, who was a financer, but not benefiting local communities. One of the other things that you may not know is that Azerbaijan is not necessarily the most democratic republic. It has a lineage of presidents, Aliyev, Haydar Aliyev, I think, is pictured here, who are known for consolidating state resources, right? Azerbaijan is mentioned in the Human Development Index as one of a perhaps less open and less democratic regimes. And so in our interviews, we heard rumors that the president, rather than using the revenue, his taxation revenue and his royalty revenue to help people, was building a presidential palace, was building swimming pools, was purchasing fleets of Mercedes Benzes and flying around on a private jet, rather than dispersing money for schools and hospitals. Now, to be fair, there was a BTC fund that Azerbaijan did put money into, and that money went back to the communities. But even then, the community said the money was delayed, or the money never arrived, or it was less than what was promised. So there was a lot of contention even over the disbursement process intended to help recipients along the pipeline corridor. The other thing that's quite tragic is, of course, oil and gas, because they were co-produced for both pipelines using the same corridor, are pollutive. And if you actually go, this is in Baku, Azerbaijan. This is a photograph that I took, and you can literally see the pollution. The water is brown, it's slimy, it has lots of sludge. And there are other photographs we took that showed oil sheens in the water. So it is not being produced in ways that are necessarily commensurate with preserving the Caspian Sea. Caspian Sea is known as a source of caviar. Caspian Sea is known for having beautiful reefs, which are being degraded by oil and gas supply, which then feed into the BTC pipeline. And look at this. This shows you some of the onshore issues. So remember, oil and gas is both offshore in the Caspian and onshore near Baku. And this just shows you one of the places near Baku, which has been termed the most polluted place on Earth, because they've been producing oil here for 100 years. The Nobel brothers, behind the Nobel Prize, were producing oil here in the 1800s. So it has like a 100-year legacy of toxic pollution. And some of these oil wells are still working, and some of them are feeding into the BTC pipeline. And again, you can see we've heard anecdotal evidence that life expectancy for these communities here is 30 to 45 years, where the average life expectancy for a human being should be 70 to 80 years because of all the toxic threats that this type of production poses. Okay, second one. Second case study is the TAGP. Now, it was hard getting photographs of the TAGP because it's underground. So this just shows you one compressor station we were able to get access to. This compressor station is part of the TAGP. It is sitting as a conduit between Thailand and Myanmar. And this is above ground near Ratchaburi. And as you can tell, it's a little less capital intensive than the BTC pipeline, but still, you've got infrastructure. You've got compressor stations, pipeline corridors, corrosion valves, monitoring stations. There's a helicopter port that's behind that building on the left. You also have pretty big infrastructure that's affiliated with the pipeline. So right near Ratchaburi, there's a pretty big natural gas power plant, which is the supply. I'm sorry, which is the demand for the pipeline. So remember, gas pipelines are conduits that disseminate gas from sources of supply to sources of demand. And of course, power, electricity supply, is a major anchor of natural gas pipelines. So in this case, parts of the TAGP pipeline feed directly into this power plant, and that means you have positive and negative issues with the power plant. You have things like methane pollution and leakage. You have things like acid rain contribution. You have things like accidents. Ratchaburi has had 2 accidents which have harmed employees because of fires. And you also have things like emissions to climate change, because natural gas is still more potent than CO2 on a 100-year time frame when you're talking about warming potential. The third case, as I mentioned, was SCORE, and this shows you a photograph near Kuching in Sarawak of plans for SCORE. It's in obviously Bahasa, which is local Malaysian languages, and again you can see these dams are massive, and this shows us, this I believe is Maroom being under construction. This is about a 900 megawatt dam. and you can see it's a major civil engineering work. They have to divert the river. They have to build a cofferdam. You have to build penstocks. You have to build a reservoir. That reservoir will flood. You need access roads. And you need huge amounts of concrete, gravel, steel, and other material. Right. So it is a project that does have negative impacts on the rainforest, all that flooding, all that vegetation. And when you talk about big dams like Bakun, the catchment area for Bakun is greater than the size of Singapore. So it is an area that is hundreds of square kilometers. And this shows you one local Iban person, which is an indigenous community in Malaysia who's been displaced. Their whole community had to relocate because what you see behind this person is their home. It is now underwater because of the flooding that you needed for the catchment area. So you've had to relocate up to 10,000 indigenous people, member of the Iban, other Orang Asli communities who've been in the rainforest for thousands of years as their natural habitat. That also means you've had to relocate a lot of these communities into more, quote, modern centers. And that means that sadly, you have what's called social disarticulation. Members of the community no longer have access to the rainforest. Members of the community have to travel further to school. So this shows you school children who used to be able to go to school in their village. But now that they've been relocated, they have to walk for 2 hours each way in the heat, in the summer, which opens them up to other health impacts like heat stress. And the other thing that's quite fascinating is we forget in Borneo, other than some of the population centers like Kuching or Kota Kinabalu, you use rivers for transport. You don't have roads. And so one of the things that all these dams do is they interfere with the ability to use river transport because you can't go through the dam. And United Nations Development Team had a report that thought that up to 80% of rural transport needs could be threatened. And you see some of these rural boats here in Borneo could be threatened by the creation of these dams because they interfere with riverine mobility. To say nothing of their environmental impacts, a lot of these dams are also altering river hydrology and creating huge amounts of sediment. Think of all that gravel and sand, and you can literally view this sediment from the air. So we took these photographs as we were flying around Borneo, and you can see it is literally changing the color of the oceans and the color of the rivers. So pretty severe environmental impacts. The final case, before I conclude, is Gobi Tech. And again, this shows you the actual area of solar energy in the Gobi Desert. This is in Mongolia, as well as parts of northern China, where they would hopefully erect these huge solar arrays. One of the things that is troublesome, though, is those solar arrays would need storage because you need to be able to provide solar energy at night. And that does involve things like heat pumps, involves things like molten salt. It involves particular chemicals that have to store liquid thermal energy at high degrees. You also have the prevalence of dust storms. This is a dust storm in Ulaanbaatar, and the bottom one shows you a map of frequency and intensity of dust storms in the catchment area, which means that Gobi Tech maybe is more challenging than you may think because you have to deal with all this sand, which both reduces the efficiency of solar production and it could literally damage the solar units. So, what does this mean? Going back to our propositions, our evidence in our interviews and our field research does confirm most of our propositions in most of the cases. So this is quite troublesome because at the start of the talk, it's titled, "Is bigger always better?" And if you want an oversimplified answer, the answer is no, it's not. Because as you scale up in size, you tend to scale up in governance and technology challenges. That's the first core finding. Core finding goes back to Bent Flyberg's point about accountability, and that is that in all of the cases, we do see overconfidence, we do see bias, we do see hubris, which means we might need to fundamentally rethink project management. Flyberg says one of the key problems of accountability is that if a mega project has a cost overrun, the government pays or society pays, not the project sponsors. And so holding the mega project designers accountable for cost overruns would be a huge step forward, could revolutionize mega project governance. And that also includes very key instruments like more transparency, better performance specifications, better regulatory regimes and rules, and better conditions on capital and bonding, perhaps sovereign guarantees that would both ensure that they run according to plan and also create revenue to hurt displaced populations or to compensate people when they lose out. So this demands that we rethink governance and financing of megaprojects as much as we rethink perhaps the technology. And I think this is also about perhaps planning for failure. Because our propositions are so significantly confirmed, that means that no mega project will succeed across all of its attributes. It might deliver oil at an economic value, but create environmental complications. Sarawak might create jobs, but displace local communities. And so it's about planning for those failures rather than presuming they don't exist. It's about competing values. Just like you see Barack Obama even use this term plan for failure when he was talking about another mega project, the Keystone XL pipeline. And that was about nested values, values of sustainability, values of economic profitability, values of community resilience and integrity were in competition. And we need to get a lot better at using multiple criteria that weigh the importance of those values in ways that are appropriate for local contexts. And I think the third thing is we absolutely suggest in the book and elsewhere that because of these challenges, smaller might be more beautiful. E.F. Schumacher, ecological economist, has a book, Small is Beautiful. Amory Lovins has another book called Small is Profitable. And I think there is something to investing in smaller, more distributed, more democratized, more modular technology that has faster rates of learning, that has less impacts to rates of failure, and that you can mass produce. You can mass produce wind turbine components in ways like cell phones, where you can't mass produce nuclear reactors or big dams. They're like cathedrals rather than cell phones. And what I've also showed you here, given I do work at an energy policy group, is the value of energy efficiency. This gets away from even megaprojects because megaprojects are about supply. You can do a lot with demand, changing behavior, investing in fuel economy, energy standards, energy certificates, energy labels, retrofits, industrial audits, changing education. And what's fascinating is in both the US, that's the left graph, and in major wealthy countries of the OECD, that's the right graph, energy efficiency is the single biggest source of energy. Far more energy has been saved than we've actually used from gas, petroleum, coal, or any source of total final energy consumption. So I really do think that there may be something to decentralization and using more distributed options, even if they're fossil fuel, distributed generation, Stirling engines, micro grids, mini grids, maybe even diesel generators, in ways that have benefits in these areas that mega projects don't. And that's quite interesting. If you look at some of the curves that McKinsey and Company did a few years ago, you can see a lot of these more modular technologies are there as the best options to fight climate change, like retrofits, better efficient motors, better behavioral changes to croplands. You don't see mega projects. Even in places like India, right, where you maybe would expect a bigger role for big technology, you also see it is these smaller, more modular options, EVs, pumping for agriculture, better lights, fly ash substitution, electric pumps, smaller modular pieces of technology rather than systems of systems changes like solar CSP or nuclear power. And with that, I'm very happy to open it back up for questions, and I appreciate you for your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sovacool, for your time. That was brilliant. I've noticed that some of our participants, just a couple, have discovered the like button. So if others would like me to ask questions in orange, which have come before the call, please like them, or type in your own question as a couple have. I'm sure Professor Sovacool will be happy to have a look at some of these questions after the presentation as well. Don't forget that there's a recording. There's a lot of information in there, so that was fascinating for me. I mean, so many of these I've heard of on the news, and I think you've gone into the detail that I personally have obviously not seen even in the newspapers. I'll start off, I think we have time for about 3 questions is my guess. And I'm going to go in order of like, so please people, like, if you want me to ask a different one than you see right now. It definitely occurred to me while you were talking, and it's hard to guess the answer to this won't be anything but modulated. But would you, especially considering there's a political driver to maybe doing these as well as a practical one, is there a way in which you would say that these mega project benefits outweigh the negatives?
It's hard to say. I mean, yes, there were a lot of benefits that did accrue. I mean, the BTC pipeline is the one that had the longest history. So we have the most to say there. And it's true, right? That pipeline created jobs, promoted energy security, even shaped Russia's geopolitical ambitions, which was the hope of the Clinton administration, because they're the ones who were the architect, Madeleine Albright and Bill Clinton. And it created a pipeline that is currently supplying about 1 million barrels of oil a day to the global market. And who knows where the world would be if we didn't have that cushion, that source of supply, given how tight oil markets could be. Maybe we'd have other oil crises like with Saudi Arabia or OPEC or Russia. So you're absolutely right. Whether the benefits exceed the cost is very difficult. And we were unable to answer that with our research design because it was very qualitative. But I suspect with somewhat sophisticated modeling, if you had a baseline and you were able to capture many of the environmental, economic, and social impacts with that modeling, you could very well answer that question.
That's great. Excellent. There's another question which I think occurred to me when you were talking about the BTC pipeline. I think this question is relevant, but I don't know if it's true, which is why I need to maybe clarify the question too. Why isn't geothermal energy used more often when the infrastructure needed to access it, such as oil drilling equipment, is readily available?
Great question. You have different answers. There's a conspiracy theory that the oil companies have very neat patents for not only geothermal, but also OTEC, which is ocean thermal energy conversion. It's basically using the temperature change between lower elements of the ocean in the top, and it's a very low carbon way to produce energy. We also have the technology. We've had it for 40 years. We don't develop it. So these people are arguing that we have major incumbents who've hoarded patents and are stopping that development. I'm not so sure about that. There is a literature on patent hoarding, and you'd be shocked at some of the things that are on record. I guess Ford had a car that was like 100 miles a gallon efficient in the 70s. They suppressed it. Westinghouse and GE suppressed compact fluorescent light bulbs for 40 years because they were concerned they last longer, so they'd sell less light bulbs. So there are these cases of patent hoarding. Maybe that's going on here a bit. I think more it's just our current energy regimes don't price a lot of their externalities. And so the true cost of energy isn't reflected in its price. And that means coal, oil, and gas are seen as artificially cheap because we're not paying for them at their full social costs. And if we were to pay for them, then all of a sudden, yes, geothermal and waste to energy and wind and solar would be a lot more affordable. But this is a market failure. And this market failure is at the heart of externalities. And even Lord Nicholas Stern said climate change is the mother of all externalities because it's such a big threat multiplier. And until we start pricing those things, we have to remind ourselves that gas and oil are artificially cheap because we're just pushing those costs to other places and other generations.
Makes sense. Okay. I don't know if there's a short answer to this question, but I think there's a related point that sort of came in. So I'll ask the shorter version of the question. You mentioned Korea and Japan. On the topic of huge mega energy projects, will nuclear energy ever be safe and risk-free?
Well, people did talk a little bit, I didn't go into this, about coupling. And so one of the neat things about Gobi Tech, once you get that grid built, there was even the idea that local sources of supply, like nuclear in North Korea, or maybe wind in South Korea, or maybe nuclear in Japan, or hydro in China, could all feed into it. Because what you're missing, only half of the price of Gobi Tech is the solar array. The other half is the grid. So some of the benefits are from the solar part, some of the benefits are from the grid part. So it wouldn't be that hard to put nuclear into that grid. And maybe North Korea would like that because they could get revenues from selling excess nuclear energy. The other question about whether nuclear itself is safe, I think falls back to this notion of externalities. Do a full accounting of externalities and time, because many of nuclear's externalities are long-lived: waste, spent fuel, accidents. And there are context and conditions where when you do that accounting, nuclear makes sense. Maybe it's a plant that's already existing. You can just refuel it, relicense it. Maybe communities accept the risks. Absolutely, it should go forward. I think the only rub for me is when you don't get a full accounting. People hide the risks, socialize them. And that's the kind of bear. We want a full cost accounting of these energy systems. If you do that full cost accounting, I'm not against any option as long as the community wants to have it.
Makes sense. We only have 3 minutes left. I wonder how quick, Henry, your question is, but somebody did brave raising their hand. So I wonder, could you ask a very quick question with a very quick answer, and then I'll do my wrap up? You'll need to unmute, Henry, if you do want to ask a question.
Oh, sorry about that. I pressed the wrong button, but actually I typed my
okay.
Thanks on my right hand side. Thank you. We know
No
there are
problem.
project under constructions. Thank
no
you
problem. That's fine.
Yeah, sorry.
That's
Yeah.
okay. So
Yeah.
let me do my wrap up then, which of course is a big thank you to Professor Sovacool, and thank you, Lucy, for the introduction. That is all we have time for today. On behalf of the British Council, let me thank Professor Sovacool for the stimulating and thought-provoking insights he shared with us today. I even see somebody mention Netflix, so who knows what's in your future, sir. I hope we will all be leaving the session, with a lot more understanding of what we read in the news, because megaprojects are certainly much discussed. I'd also like to thank the Singapore Association for the Deaf and Ms. Rashida for supporting us with the sign language interpretation during the session. We will be posting the recording of this video on our Knowledge is Great Lectures webpage and our social media channels within the next few days. So please feel free to share this with your friends and colleagues who are unable to join us today. Actually, the contact details also for Professor Sovacool you will also see in the video as well. So there are ways in which you can follow up. So once again, thanks everyone for being part of this great lecture. Do remember that we will continue to run these lectures once every month for the rest of the year. The next session will be on the 24th of June at 5 p.m. Singapore time. Professor Hamid Moghal from the University of Strathclyde will open up the conversation on what the future of manufacturing might look like. What signs of this future are already with us, and what steps need to be taken to maximize the opportunities for positive economic, environmental, and social impact. We look forward to seeing you all next month. Have a good evening, everyone, and see you soon. Thank you again.